I've had the privilege for the past 30 years, roughly, working in on both the Bering and Chukchi shelves. These are the largest continental shelves the United States has control over, and we share with Russia, as pointed out in the last session. And also, I put this picture up just so you can see that there are a few places in Alaska that you can see Russia. And what I wanted to start with was just, I do ecosystem research, and there's a rich legacy. It's not that well known, but going back to the 1972 environmental agreement between the USSR and USA, signed by President Nixon and Brezhnev in Moscow in 1972, led to a number of research cruises. So even in the Cold War era, we had active multidisciplinary oceanographic cruises that went across the border between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at that time and Russia now. And it's a great challenge, as Kelly Faulkner mentioned in the last panel. We really need, in order to know and understand the ecosystem, to be able to go across this invisible line between the two countries, because all of the nutrients, all of the rich Pacific water that's brought up onto the shelf in the Bering Sea and then flows north through Bering Strait is on the Russian side. And so we have a sort of an incomplete view of the ecosystem. And it's important because there's huge numbers of changes happening in this system. And we know, for example, the sea ice is disappearing, the water temperature is getting warmer. There's a lot more fresh water in the Arctic than there used to be a couple of decades ago. And all of these things have our physical effects, but we don't know what the ecosystem effects are. And so those are, are the fish going to move north? Are animals affected by sea ice disappearing, plankton blooms changing, and so forth? So part of the rich history are these cruises that happened starting in 1976, 1984, 1992. This is the Bear Pack program, and so I've got a couple of the covers of the monographs that came out of this. U.S. and Russian scientists working together in general on Russian ships, but freely crossing the international date line and doing the research that needed to be done. And a successor program to this, and I've got the special issue that came out a couple of years ago, is the Rusalka program that was supported by NOAA. And as Dave Kennedy mentioned, has been suspended for reasons of, I think that maybe the NOAA people can comment, and I'm sure Kathy might have a little bit to say on it. She heroically led that program for more than a decade, putting these cruises together that happened in 2004, 2009, 2013, as well as cruises that help support the mooring replacements in Bering Strait, including on the Russian side. So this is the legacy. We've got a lot of data. We have a lot of understanding. And we're sort of in a rebuilding year, I guess you'd say, now, because these ecosystem studies are no longer going across the U.S.-Russian border. So what are the sort of things that people think are going to happen? I don't have time to go through a lot of science today, so we put up a little cartoon instead. This is what we think. These are shallow seas, so all the production gets to the bottom rather quickly. There's a lot of production associated with sea ice, so as the sea ice melts and all of that material gets to the bottom, if the sea ice disappears, as it is disappearing in this little higher CO2 and higher methane world that we live in now, we think that other organisms are going to come in. So bowhead whales are going to be replaced by other humpbacks and other whales moving north, that killer whales are going to move in, that a lot more material is going to be synthesized in the water column and eaten there. So that's what the scientific hypothesis is. What is a research program that involves lots of countries sailing through Bering Strait? And so I provide this example, the Distributed Biological Observatory, that's supported by a number of agencies through the Interagency Arctic Research Planning Committee that was referred to in the last panel. NSF supports us on a ship that we go up every year on. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But there are other countries that bought into this, and so we have a total of 6 countries, and the only probably thing that we need to do with this panel is maybe fade out the Russian flag for the time being, because Rusalka was the Russian participation in this ecosystem study of how things are changing in the Pacific Arctic, in that part of the Arctic that's closest to the United States. All of those boxes that are up there on that picture are places where there's high diversity, high production, and so we've been going back every year and looking at them. And so in a few weeks, in July next month, I'll be on the Canadian ship in the lower left-hand corner, the Sir Wilfrid Laurier, which kind of, it goes to the Canadian Arctic every year anyway, so it's sailing through U.S. waters into Canada, where it has a buoy tending mission, does some channel markers, things like this in the Canadian Arctic, and so we've hitched a ride on it every year since 1998, and so we've built up and we stop at the same places every year, and so that's the concept of the Distributed Biological Observatory. We're trying to hit the same places every year, see how the system has changed, and then talk to other countries sending their ships, so the Koreans, the Chinese, the Japanese, Canadians, US, and Russians have been involved in sampling these same locations, briefly doing some basic sampling and seeing how the system has changed. And later in the summer, another example, of course, is the Healy. We'll be on that at the end of the summer, doing some sampling with the support of NOAA along the same set of stations. And the idea has been picked up. The Europeans are starting up a distributed biological observatory in Svalbard, and the Canadians are expanding eastward. As you can see, we just do the first 5 stations that are first 5 group of boxes that are in the United States, and the Canadians have moved into the Canadian Beaufort, and their other BOEM is interested in obviously in the areas in the Beaufort Sea. So what does it come down to? We have some tools that are available to in this rebuilding phase that we're going through, and so I put this example up. We were in Russia a couple of years ago with Kathy's support when she was with NOAA, writing these papers with our Russian colleagues that were put in that special issue of Oceanography that came out in September 2015. This is just so old school. You go into Boris, he must be about 80 and still going to Vietnam and collecting chitons. That's his specialty. So he's a chiton taxonomist. So we were in his office. I said, Jackie, get a picture of that, because it's just it's a fire trap, but it's sort of amazing to see. We've lost all of that taxonomy, so we really have to tie. And so anyway, the point of this slide is we have a lot of friends. We have a lot of personal relationships we've built up over the decades. That we worked with Boris back as late as or as early as 1988, and still working with him. And so. There are a couple of other tools that are available to us. The International Arctic Science Committee has been mentioned. This is the non-governmental science coordination body that's now has its secretariat in Iceland, that 24 countries are members of. It has an international science initiative in the Russian Arctic, which is really just an action group of experts who get together and talk once a year with Russian participation about what some of the issues are, visas, importing, exporting samples, this sort of thing, the things that come up. So that structure exists. And then there are other organizations. The Pacific Arctic Group has been mentioned, which has been key to bringing the Koreans, the Chinese, and the Japanese into this interest in doing work in the Distributed Biological Observatory and sampling those locations. And finally, just going back to that U.S.-Russian agreement in 1972 is a good basis. It was initially charged ahead by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, led that before NOAA did. And this is my last slide, just to come back to the language that's in the Fairbanks Declaration. This is obviously another tool, as the managers who were up here last panel told us, that they've put a new tool in the tool set to help build U.S.-Russian cooperation in the Arctic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lee. And now I invite Kathy to give some remarks.
Okay. I wanted to start out by telling you something of how I actually got started working with Russia in the Arctic. Well, it was first of all, I was a geophysicist studying volcanoes on the seafloor, hydrothermal vents. And I was very much in tune with the funding of National Geographic Society to take great photographs of weird, unusual animals all over the seafloor. And they actually were the responsible party for getting me involved in using Russian equipment, mainly the Mir submersibles, the two of them, and one of their Pisces submersibles in Lake Baikal. And the way it happened was this: I was at Columbia University, and I got a call from one of my camera friends, photographers from Geographic, and he said, "Kathy, I already told all the Russian Academy of Sciences that you're going to find hot water vents in Lake Baikal, so you better say yes." So I said, okay. So the thing was, we wanted to work with Russia in looking at a very unique ecosystem within Russia itself that you could take some marvelous imagery and learn a tremendous amount about evolution in a small little region. So I happily went along with that, and our relationships grew from just the Pisces in Lake Baikal and searching for hot springs there, to actually being involved in using the two Russian Mir submersibles. And I have to give National Geographic a tremendous hand for really seeing the benefit, the future of us using our submersibles together. And another one of the fantastic things about Russia was the Mirs come in pairs of two. So if you could actually use one as a camera and the other one as a subject of your film. And we did develop programs before the end of the Soviet Union to use the Mirs. They were also funded by National Science Foundation and the IMAX Foundation, who felt that these tools were really fantastic to be able to use and offered us a lot of help. So that kept our relationship going. We decided to build, actually with the interest of the United States Navy, the Naval Research Lab, the opportunity to carry out and build, first of all, international missions in the Norwegian Greenland Sea and around the Svalbard part of the Arctic Ocean. And this involved collaborations, first time between Russia, Norway, and the United States. And then we added in Germany and I don't know who else. But they were very, very successful, and each party brought to the table something really unique and special that everyone else could use. And in these cases, we were using the Mir submersibles, but we had geophysical equipment from the US, from Germany, from Norway. And we really built a tremendous rapport. And the first expedition then was on a Russian ship, which I actually really like sailing on Russian ships because generally they're very large and they don't move much in the ocean. But so our ambassador from the US to Norway did come to meet us in Spitsbergen, where we signed off on all the diplomatic issues about this. And that grew, those programs grew and grew through time because of our abilities to merge high technology from all the different regions and add increments of funding and all that. At the end of the Cold War, Sherry Goodman mentioned this earlier, it was a very big deal because of the realization that there was probably a lot of contamination in the Arctic Ocean or on the seafloor because of nuclear waste. And I was called by the Naval Research Laboratory to come and help set up their nuclear waste assessment program with Russia, because we had had the experience with Russia. We knew the people, the technicians, the engineers, everything. So that became my next foray for many, many years into our collaboration with getting data back from Russia and sharing data. We actually brought in about 30 Russian scientists to the Naval Research Lab to process their data, which at that time was really important to them because their institutions were just collapsing all around them. And so, of course, we built up a lot of fantastic rapport. I mean, most of these scientists stayed at my house. So it was, that later developed into more marine geology type activities with some of the same people. And I have to give the credit, I think real credit, to the Nunn-Lugar activities that encouraged our United States government to set up collaboration with science communities and engineers. And so we really, in the Navy, I was there at the time, it was really a great honor for me to really move in that direction. At the end of this period of time, it was still continuing as we were trying to map out objects on the seafloor that may contribute to radioactive waste contamination, and we realized we knew nothing much about currents, where are they coming from, going to, what is the interaction with the seafloor, if a reactor had already gone off, but where were the remnants now? And so many cruises were funded to take samples all across the Arctic Ocean, and there's many, many countries. At that point, I definitely had the bug of working together with Russia. I found it so fulfilling to be with people which, prior to those times, everyone thought of as enemies, and not so at all. Through this program, I was then offered a job at NOAA to work with John Calder in the Arctic Research Program. And NOAA's main geographic interest was not actually near Spitsbergen or on the Arctic side Atlantic side of the Arctic, but on the Pacific side of the Arctic, because that's where our fisheries are, and we have neighbors there. So I was asked to try to set up a program with Russian scientists on the Pacific side of the Arctic. And in fact, we made it a point of calling it not the Western Arctic, which the US and Canada call it, but we called it the Pacific Arctic because the Russians refer to that area as the Eastern Arctic, so there's always confusion of what they're talking about. That program we named the Rusalka program, the Russian-American Long-Term Census of the Arctic. And it was really a great effort to expand on the connections that we had made earlier in the studies of contamination in the Arctic, and to really expand out in the world of biology and chemistry, and then put in a series of moorings all the way across the Bering Strait so we could really get some understanding of not just what half of the flow is up to the Arctic, but what the whole flow is, and what's actually flowing with it, the nutrients. The program lasted for somewhat over 10 years, and I really don't like the word terminated, actually, there. I think it's dormant. It would be a nicer word for us to put there. We have had, in the last few years since, for combinations of reasons, sanctions and other issues, some difficulties in getting ships. But I will say one thing which I thought was very innovative and very much involved our two governments was that I ended up leading this program with my partner, Alexei Ostrovsky, who was science counselor at the US Embassy here. And we were both geophysicists and had known each other for our work, and we decided, well, we're both now in the government, we might as well do something worthwhile, so let's start this program. And we realized we probably weren't going to get anywhere very fast unless we incorporated all the different factions of people who might want to fight against the program. So we decided to bring everyone in so we would all be on the same team. And that's included having the Russian Navy being actually the head of the Rusalka program. And we were sponsored by the Admiral Alexeyev from Gningi, and a fantastic gentleman who has since died, unfortunately. And really, I think that relationship with the Russian Navy on board with us, every expedition, gave everyone a goal towards moving forward. And I've exceeded greatly my 5-minute limit. Mm-hmm. And so, but doesn't come close to a decade.
You've got 10 seconds.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. I know there's a rich history there and a lot to go through in such a short amount of time, but I appreciate very much not only what you presented today, but your long engagement and positive engagement, so thank you. Next, we have Nuke, who will speak on behalf of UIC Science. Thank you very much, Duke.
First of all, thank you, John. Thank you, Mike, for allowing me to speak here. It's a very humbling experience, and I appreciate it very much. So I'm going to as you mentioned, Nagruk Harcharek, I'm the general manager for UIC Science, and we provide and have been continuing the long tradition of incorporating and enhancing Western science with traditional knowledge in Barrow through, by providing the logistics. The research, we also manage the Barrow Arctic Research Center and the Barrow Environmental Observatory, and it's very unique. We have the research center and the observatory's location is very unique in the sense that there's a community right next door, and there. We have a long history of supporting research. It goes back to the first International Polar Year, all the way through the first days of the Naval Arctic Research Laboratory, where some of the first jobs for the people of Harcharek were at the research center. And there's lots of stories of them bringing in small mammals and trading them in for quarters and nickels and taking that to the store, and that was their money for the day. So we were helping them out then, and at all the ice camps. Our people are very familiar with sea ice, and they were utilized for their expertise out at the ice camps that were stationed outside of Barrow. And we continue that tradition to this day, and one of the challenges that we face, even with the building of the new bark facility that we currently reside in right now, is we're still utilizing some of the same facilities that they utilized in the early days of the NARL, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So UIC, our corporate management, has identified it as a priority to build up our infrastructure, our science research support infrastructure, so that we can continue to support the very best research in the world and continue to be the flagship station for the Arctic research for the United States. And we're hoping to continue that tradition.
Great, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate that and the good work that UIC does. And I think, as you were telling me before we got together, there's even some examples of where UIC Science has assisted Russian adventurers. Could you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting story. So there was I don't remember the gentleman's name, but they were doing a expedition from Russia across the North Pole to Canada, and then they were following the coast and then all the way up to Barrow, and then from Barrow all the way back to Russia. But the whole point of it was to stay out on the sea ice. And it took them a number of years just to get to Barrow. When they got to Barrow one year, the sea ice conditions were to the point where they could not continue on. So they decided to, they worked with us to store their vehicles, all of their equipment, everything for the year. So we pulled everything out of Connex vans, we put everything in there, and they went home. And the next year, the following year, they came back, and despite some issues with customs, we assisted them in getting all of their stuff ready and providing everything that we could. They had very unique equipment that you couldn't go down to Napa Auto Parts to get parts for. So we did what we could, scrounged up everything that we could. They actually even bought, and we supplied them with some local traditional foods, and we got them on their way. And actually they have a website where we have a picture with them as well. So that was an example of a very successful collaboration with them. And we were happy to see them, and they were happy that we were there to help them out as well. So.
Yes, thank you, Nuke. You continue in a long line of history of support from the region, not only to support the science, but also to participate in the science. And I'm so glad to see you, on behalf of UIC Science, continuing that tradition and continuing to work with us. I see you actively engaged with the Arctic Icebreaker Coordinating Committee and with other efforts accordingly. And with international partners, as you've said. You talked about Chinese scientists coming in to get support and others. So keep up the good work, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
Last we have Dmitry, and just a note before he begins, Dmitry was born in Russia and he continues to do research in Russia. Unfortunately, we were not able, with such short notice, to have a Russian-based Russian scientist with us today, but it does give me a chance to give you a teaser for an upcoming meeting that the Arctic Research Commission and the National Ice Center are part of, about a little less than a month from today in Washington, about a half mile from here, at the Naval Heritage Center, We will be having a 3-day symposium. We do this every 2 years. This will be the 7th year, so this stretches back 14 years now. This symposium is titled The Impacts of an Ice-Diminished Arctic on Naval and Maritime Operations. And thanks to the WWF, who has helped with logistics, we were able to bring 3 Russian scientists over to participate in this symposium, and we're very pleased about that. There's more information at arctic.gov, and I encourage all of you to come. Registration is free. But back to this session, Dmitry, who is at George Washington University, will give us a few words about his experiences as a practitioner of Arctic research.
Thank you, John. It's very nice to be here. It's really a pleasure that we have this Polar Initiative in Wilson Center. I just want to mention that when I came to Washington in 2010, I always thought, I've always dreamed to be in the Arctic group. And I made Arctic group on my card, my business card. There was no group. But now we have a big group, and no one even surprises when we talk about Arctic and they see we're from Washington, D.C. So just to give few examples of continued collaboration, and I really don't see, much point of, confirming that Russia and United States are partners in the Arctic. There are many ongoing projects, research projects on both sides involving American and Russian scientists, both bilaterally and internationally. But I just want to give you a few examples. It's interesting that I just thought it all started in '99. It was a horrible year, it was financial crisis in Russia. And me and my friend were trying to get to Turkey on a car which was 20 years old, and he just bought it. We didn't make it past his driveway, so there was no alternative. All tickets were sold, everything was expensive, so someone said, well, you can go to the Arctic on an expedition. So that's how I ended up in Yamal Peninsula, near Bovanyankovo. It was kind of interesting trip because it required 5 hours on a helicopter to get there from Vorkuta. Logistics was horrible. Helicopter couldn't pick us up for 7 days, I think, 5 or 7 days. And it's interesting that now you can get there by train. Right? So Arctic is a very interesting region. It changes very fast, both environmentally, but also there are huge transformations, both social and political, economical transformations that occurred over this short period of time. So to study those transformations with the scientists, both physical and social scientists, we need data. Unfortunately, Arctic is that region where this data is very sparse. If we want to have some understanding of any process, if we want to have some projections and recommendations for policymakers, we have to rely on data. There is no data, and I think this is still a big problem, and I'm really glad that there is a push on all levels to sort of connect various countries, and including Russia and the United States. But just to give a few examples, we have very close collaborations with several institutions. I, by background, is a cryolithologist and glaciologist. I'm interested in ice, mostly ground ice. And as a climatologist, I'm interested in how this changing climate and human activities influence ecosystems, both natural ecosystems and those ecosystems that are being modified by human presence. To understand it, you have to be really international, and of course, you saw that map many times. Russia is the largest Arctic territory. You cannot solve any scientific questions if you do not consider participants from Russia. We have several, probably 6 or 7, federally funded projects right now at GW that target various aspects of Arctic, starting from hydrology and permafrost, all the way to human migration, indigenous populations, and Arctic urban sustainability. Those are federally funded projects. They all have very substantial Russian component. The question becomes, how do we formalize those relationships? Because it is not easy, both financially or logistically, to formalize those. And it's getting better. I think we have positive experience over the last 10, 15 years, but certainly we have challenges. For example, recently we have a lot of Russian partners who don't want to receive any funds from United States for their work because they're afraid to be labeled as, foreign agents and things like that. But the research collaborations continues. I think for Russians it's very beneficial to have bilateral collaboration with the United States because it really allows publications in better journals. English language is always a problem in Russia. So this is one thing. It allows Russians to use better sometimes or just more expensive equipment. And obviously there are some problems with moving this equipment. Hopefully this agreement will help it. And for American scientists, it's pretty obvious that, without involvement of Russian partners, our understanding of Arctic as a system, whether it's natural system, whether it's human system, is impossible.
Thank you very much, Dima. I appreciate that. And I also encourage you during the reception to see if you can identify Andrei Petrov, who is in the audience with us today, another Russian by birth who is now at Iowa, and he can also tell you about this. We have time for, I think, 2 questions tops, if anyone has any. Thank you, Andrei.
Yeah, I can identify myself. So I'm Andrei Petrov, and I'm upcoming president of the International Arctic Social Sciences Association. So I thought it will be voice of a social scientist. So I have small comments saying for our association, IASA, 25% of membership is Russian. So that's an important number that we need to appreciate, and we need to make sure that there is multilateral, bilateral relations with the science. And of course, in the United States, we have a wonderful NSF Arctic Social Sciences program that does invest in circumpolar research, like Dima suggested, right? And that should continue. My question, I guess, would be if you could reflect on how you work, how your collaborative work was transformational in respect to, say, local communities. How does it help those residents, whether on the Russian side, on the US side, with whom you had a chance to work, if you had a chance to work with people? I know some of you did. So how the fact that it's a collaborative work helps locals and local community address their needs?
Thank you for the question. Anyone? Kathy?
Try to keep this short. And from my perspective, actually, much of my time in the government was working on working groups with the Arctic Council. And I was the US lead for a marine biodiversity program for the Arctic and out of the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna. And in that wide array, it included a lot of permanent participants from the local communities all around. And so we did try to hire, actually, or gather information that all of these local communities had gathered about the status of their biodiversity change, or just doing baseline studies all around the Arctic. And so I think in that way we had a very positive input from the local residents as well as the other biologists, which I was able to get several of them from our Rusalka program to be the Russian representatives, so we could do that. So that's one way that through the Arctic Council we were able to do that.
Thank you.
I could tell you from a community standpoint, providing logistics, the science that comes into our community provides very meaningful and year-round work. I have a staff of 15 in Barrow, 15 people in Barrow, and more so in the summertime that work full-time for me, from doing things like bear guarding and such for people out on the sea ice, to just general labor and construction on the environmental observatory. So community science and community interaction, I think, is very important. I hope the model that we have in Barrow of supporting science at a local level and indigenous level can be a model to use in other places of the world internationally as well. So.
Great, thank you very much. I think I'll take prerogative of the moderator here just to wrap up with a closing statement. And I read something interesting by Paul Krugman, who writes opinion pieces for the New York Times. And I think what we've done with these two panels is I hope, begun to prove him incorrect on something. And he said, we live in a post-Enlightenment age in which rationality, science, evidence, logical argument, and debate have lost the battle in many sectors, perhaps even in society generally, to superstition, faith, opinion, and orthodoxy. And I think what you've heard in these last two panels are efforts to push back against that. And I hope you'll agree with me that great progress is being made in that regard in the Arctic and in our scientific cooperation between the U.S. and Russia. So again, panelists, thank you very much. Mike, back to you.
Okay.